I just think Conan Doyle does that brilliantly.
Well, he is great, but that is, I find it interesting because he's kind of the dividing line between sensationalist fiction like Wilkie Collins, The Moonstone and all, and the deductive, you know, the detective story with deduction.
Yes.
And yet that one story is really sensationalist, and I think it makes an impact because it's so scary, but it really isn't a detective story. You know, it's more revelation when you go back and look at it.
That's a, well,
I just
would
was
not argue. You're
fascinated
absolutely right.
because I picked the story thinking it would be such a great example, you know, of detective fiction for these kids, and they all looked at me afterward. It's like, where was the detection? You know, the snake.
That snake came out of the...
And even the bed. I mean, even one of them pointed out to me, even the way the room is set up was so arbitrary. Why would you have the bed
under the bed?
Under the, you know, I mean, it's so but the point is, he did make that huge impact.
Yes. And
as you say, it could change your life. I always recommend Doyle for kids, for teenagers.
It was the starting point for me. I mean, it's just that adolescent thing. I have an older brother, so Hardy Boys was the first thing, and before I found Nancy Drew. But then he wasn't a reader the way I am, and he was carrying around this thick book for days and was engrossed in it. And so I knew there had to be something if it caught his attention, and I literally purloined it from his room, and that was my introduction to Conan Doyle. And I just thought the storytelling ability that he transported me to that time and place, and then these deductive, that whole use of the brain without leaving his room to solve these things. I just, it definitely hooked me, and I've given it to so many friends, to the children of so many friends as they approach adolescence, because I just think the storytelling is brilliant.
It is. It's sort of depressing to think he wound up looking for fairies in the bottom of the garden and got fooled by, you know, well, anyway, so we've talked about the vineyard, which is always a building block in your books, and then we have Alexandra Cooper, who is not you, but is certainly drawn from your career as prosecutor of sex crimes in New York City. How did you get into such a job?
In a very, very serendipitous way. I wanted to write. I majored in English literature, and every yearbook from junior high school on, ambition, writer, and my father, whom I adored, by the end of college, when I had immersed myself in 19th century English literature and American literature, and I used to say, I want to write. He'd say, you have nothing to write about, get a job. And I mean, how it just turned out so oddly. I went to law school because my other interest was public service. I very much thought that not for a career, but for a period of time, the law would be a wonderful vehicle to do something, to give back, I mean, to do something for the community. And so I went to law school, as you know, at a time when there were not a lot of women in the profession.
Right.
Got out in 1972. There were 170 lawyers in the Manhattan DA's office, and 7 of them were women. And Frank Hogan, a legendary figure in the law in New York and nationally, said to me during the interview, this work is too tawdry for a woman of your educational background. And he did not let women try felony cases in court. And, you know, young lawyers today look at every crime show on television and you can do anything. But I went to that office thinking I'd do appellate work, thinking I'd be in the law library with a handful of other women there. And everything began to change in the mid-'70s, and everything became possible. So I did not go to do the work that became my sort of signature, crimes of violence against women, but I was moved into that position when the laws began to change 2 years later, and Bob Morgenthau, who's still the DA, became district attorney, and there were no women. He thought it was important to have a woman leading that unit as sort of a figurehead, hoping it would interest more women in coming in.
How long has Bob Morgenthau been the DA in New York? A whole lifetime.
Oh, yes. He's was elected in 75. I can't do the math. 75 for the first time and reelected last year. So, and truly a legend in law enforcement, and has changed that office remarkably, and is just one of the most brilliant, forward-thinking people. The innovations in everything from white-collar crime that nobody in U.S. attorneys' offices would touch, to our unit, to the first cold case unit in the country. I mean, just so many groundbreaking things. still
that
doing
cold
them.
case thing is fascinating, and I've been intrigued about how many crime writers have glommed onto.
Yes.
Not to mention television,
Right.
but I think we just had a write-up here in Phoenix where they're trying to, get clues, work out an old case, and of course, you've talked to me in the past about DNA evidence, how really tough it was to do anything with it way back.
Right. Was presented to me for the first time, probably one of the first 5 offices in the country to be asked to use DNA in 1986, not accepted by any court in America till '89. So we could use it in our investigations as we did, but the judges in the evidentiary hearings said not admissible before the jury. And then the science began to evolve and became more reliable. And to this day, I mean, I stepped down from the DA's office in 2002, but I get a call at least once every 6 weeks from my colleagues about cases that I worked on in the 70s and 80s that are being solved now by DNA.
Does that mean that you had to store some evidence in order to have DNA present, or what?
Yes, and some of it, Barbara, was stored by luck. Some of it wasn't even thinking that these substances would last. Sometimes we just solved, and I write about it in Cooper's next adventure for 2008, a case that was tried in 1974, long before anybody had heard the letters DNA in a forensic sense. And there was a hung jury. The victim was a young woman my age then, 1974, in New York City, whose apartment was burglarized. And the jury, the laws were so archaic, the jury was not allowed to convict the man without independent evidence, which didn't exist. There was no DNA. So the jury hung. The man named Clarence Williams disappeared. And 18 months ago, he went into a gun store in Georgia, where he now lives, to buy a gun, and was fingerprinted for the cooling down period. The fingerprint matched the warrant, the missing man from 1974. When he showed up to pick up his gun, the police arrested him, took his DNA, and he was linked to 50 cases that occurred, 50 cases that occurred in New York, New Jersey, Chevy Chase, Maryland, North Carolina, Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, down to Georgia, after that victim testified and was not credible enough to be believed. And she came back and testified again last year, and he was convicted. And the only reason, it goes back to your question, a sloppy prosecutor, a guy who was a complete mess, put the folder with her underwear and bed clothing back in the back of a file cabinet. Had he returned it to the police department, it would have been thrown out in the interim. And conscientious prosecutors found the old file, found the old bed sheets, and that's how the DNA was connected. Simply a mistake. If he'd ever done the right thing with it, there'd be no case.
Amazing. Did he rape her too? Is that why he had to have that
yes,
stuff?
I'm sorry. Yes, he raped her too.
I mean, it couldn't have been just a simple burglary.
No. He raped her too, and I write about it. She asked me to write about it. She asked me to tell the story because she had to live with what she said was the guilt, the shame, the idea that she couldn't convince 12 intelligent people of this matter when in fact it was the law. The judge in those days was allowed to say to the jury, ladies lie. And you can't, the jury doesn't necessarily have to believe her if there's not independent evidence. Well, by the way, now there's independent evidence and it's DNA. So she got her day in court. And it's not the main case I use, but it's a back thread. It's a case I have Alex Cooper trying to sort of show the forensic techniques that have changed the law.
But even in this book, you still show that you can't get away from the fact that in rape cases, the victim is often the person on trial.
Absolutely. And I think that was the most haunting, the hardest thing about getting victims in the 70s and 80s to trust us. And because there was such a bad history, it still remains hard to do. But it is hard to do. The most fun thing, if I could, creating in this book, I have so many, since you're at the bar, I've been at the bar, I have so many defense attorney friends who've complained through 8 books that all of my defense attorneys have been sleazy characters. And so a group of them took me to lunch and said, you really need an elegant and eloquent adversary for Alex. And